So this one's for Jack, who has a biology exam coming up, and he wants to know about symbiosis. Yeah, symbiosis. So, symbiosis is where two animals have a relationship with each other. So, like, as a whale or something, it changes its status to in a relationship with shellfish, and the shellfish are like, hello, Mr. Whale! And the whale's just like, I'm a whale. Nom. Nom. And so the shellfish is just like, Mr. Whale, your mouth seems awfully dirty, let me clean it for you. Other shellfish. It's a cannibal for some reason. And the whale's just like, you're cleaning my mouth, this is good. And he's just like, you're feeding me, this is good too. You're feeding me, this is good too. And that is mutualistic because the feelings between the two of them are mutual. They're both enjoying their relationship. And then there's another one called Communalism. And that one's difficult, but it's where one benefits and the other doesn't get anything. It doesn't benefit or get damaged or anything. And that's like some ants crawling across the floor, and the ants are just like, we're ants, we're ants, we're ants, we're ants, we're ants, we got the answers because we're ants, we're ants. And behind them there's loads of like things being thrown up because they're like walking. So the birds are just like, I'm gonna eat those things them ants are stirring up. Nom! And then, so that ants don't get harmed, but the bird gets food. So that's brilliant. And then finally there's one with humans, which is parasitic, which is just quite disturbing, because you've got like a human, say Arnold Schwarzenegger, going, I am eating some salad. Salad. But inside that salad is a tapeworm. And the tapeworm goes, inside Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Arnold Schwarzenegger just like, I don't feel too... He has to go to the toilet. He's just like, I'll be back. Of course, the tapeworm gets all the food that's inside Arnold, but Arnold just gets all the sickness that was inside Arnold, which isn't a good thing. And Arnold's just like, no, I do not feel so good today. And the tapeworm's just like, yeah, I have food, nom 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 nom, inside Arnold's stomach. And that is parasitism.
Hey guys, this is Mr. Mahmood, and you are watching the fifth and final video of the Ecology unit. Congratulations for making it this far. I know the last couple of videos have been a little long, so I'm going to do what I can to really cut these short so that we can get to the point and be ready to move on. There are two key concepts that I need you to understand by the end of this. The first one is symbiosis, which our British chap from the intro video hopefully did a good job of introducing to you. The second concept is ecological succession, which also is going to be very important, so we'll talk about both of those. Let's start by getting into symbiosis. So to understand what symbiosis means, or the word symbiotic means, let's break it down. The prefix sym means together. If you guys have ever played the video games The Sims, like computer games, where you make people and have them do different things and have them all living together, that's why they call it The Sims, because sim means together. And then biotic, I hope you guys know what that means by now. It means living. So symbiotic or symbiosis literally means living together. So these are the different ways that organisms can live together. A lot of times when we talk about food chains, we're going to discuss how the relationships are. And in order for there to be some kind of relationship, consistent relationship between species over a long period of time, there has to be some relationship where it's benefiting. At least one side has to gain something out of it, or else nobody's going to be involved in that kind of relationship. If there are two people that are just butting heads with each other consistently, that's not actually any kind of relationship that they're going to want. But as we're going to talk about, it's unavoidable in some situations. So we'll get to that when we get to competition. Let's start with the three general categories of symbiosis. There are three ways that organisms can live together. The first way is called mutualism. Just like the guy in the video said, mutualism is like a mutual relationship. If you've ever heard the feeling is mutual, that means you feel the same way. When we talk about mutualism in terms of organisms working together, it's one benefiting and the other benefiting as well. So when we talk about mutualistic relationships, we talk about each side getting something out of the relationship, which means both parties are happy and everybody is perfectly accepting this type of relationship. There are a few different examples of mutualism. Some common ones are flowers and insects, like the bees that come and feed off of the nectar and pollen from a flower. The bee or the insect obviously gains a food source, which is a benefit for the bee, and the flower actually helps in its pollination. So when the insect comes in and feeds off of the pollen, some of that pollen sticks to the bee, and then the bee will fly to another flower, drop its pollen into that flower. So now the flower gets assistance with its pollination. So both sides are benefiting from the relationship. That's a good example of mutualism. So mutualism is where both sides benefit. Commensalism, notice in the video he called it communalism. Please understand that's not correct. He's not exactly the science expert. It's just a good video to show you a little intro. But commensalism is when one organism benefits and the other one is unaffected. So that means it doesn't gain or lose anything from the relationship. There are a few good examples of commensalism. Barnacles on a whale are usually the one we use most often. A barnacle is an animal that doesn't have the ability of movement. So instead it has to attach itself to surfaces and hope that food comes to it. So you'll see a lot of barnacles on rocky shores. If you go to any sort of coastlines that have a lot of rocks, you'll see a lot of barnacles attached to the rocks. So when the tide comes in, all the water brings with it all the food source that they can feed off of. But you'll also see them attaching themselves to large sea animals, whether they're mammals like whales or other types of very, very large fish. So a barnacle on a whale is benefiting because the barnacle being attached to the whale is allowing itself to get where it needs to go for food. So the whale takes it to an open food source and it's able to feed off of it. At the same time, it's not doing anything to harm the whale. The whale has an incredibly thick outer layer of blubber that has absolutely no sort of effect or understanding of that sensation to the whale. So even though the barnacles are attached to the whale's not losing anything or feeling any sort of pain from it. It's also not gaining anything. Neither way, nothing really, nothing happens for the whale. So the barnacle benefits, the whale is unaffected. So it doesn't gain or lose anything. That's called commensalism. And the third category is called parasitism. Again, if you think of a parasite, you think of something negative, right? Because it is. And in terms of parasitism, one organism is benefiting because it's actually feeding off of the other. But there's a big difference between parasitism and predation. Be careful here. Predation is like predator and prey. Big difference there. Let's finish out with parasitism. With parasitism, one side benefits, the other side is harmed because one side is actually feeding off the other. The big difference is usually, and I say usually because there are exceptions, but usually the organism that's being eaten or fed on does not die. So we're usually talking about the parasite being pretty small compared to the organism that's being fed on. The organism that's being harmed in a parasitic relationship is often referred to as a host. So if you ever hear us referring to what type of relationship involves a host, that would be parasitism, and the host is the one that's being harmed. So most blood-feeding insects, or really all blood-feeding insects, fall into the category of parasitism. So ticks, fleas, leeches, things like that, when they feed off of a large host, whether that be humans, dogs, other animals, the insect definitely benefits by getting a food source. The host is being fed on, losing nutrients, and therefore it's harmed, right? So parasitism is where one organism benefits, the other one is harmed, but usually the host is not killed in the process. There are exceptions, right? Mosquitoes can pass West Nile or things like that and could cause other problems, malaria, other things like that. But most of the time when a parasite feeds off of its host, it doesn't kill the host. And that usually helps out the parasite because it can keep coming back and feeding off of that host multiple times. So that's the big difference between parasitism and predation. Parasitism, one side benefits, the other side is harmed. In predation, it's the same idea. One side benefits, the other side is harmed. But with a predator-prey relationship, hopefully you know this by now, the predator eats and kills the prey. It kills the prey and then eats it. So this is significantly different from parasitism. 100% of the time, the predator will kill its prey and feed off of it. So predator-prey relationship, one side benefits, the other side is harmed, but it's actually killed in the process. So parasitism, the host is not usually killed in the process. And then finally we get to the idea of competition. I told you guys there's a situation where it's inevitable if two organisms have no choice but to be in the same environment together, they're going to be in the same environment together. And this usually happens within the same trophic level of a food chain. If you have two organisms of the two different species, both going for the same food source, then neither one of them is gaining anything out of that. They're both being harmed because they're both having less nutrients available. But for that ecosystem, that's all they have to feed on, so they have no choice but to fight for that food and to try to make sure that they can get to the food before the other, or ways to gain an advantage. So that's what we consider competition. So in terms of this chart, competition is where both organisms are actually being harmed because they're both losing a food source. So make sure you understand the differences between here. Go mutualism, both sides benefit. Commensalism, one side benefits, the other side is unaffected. Parasitism, one side benefits, the other side is harmed, but usually not killed. And the one that's harmed is called the host. Predation, also one side benefits, the other one's harmed, but this time the one that's harmed is killed. And we haven't mentioned this yet, but the one that's killed is referred to as the prey. The one that's feeding and killing is referred to as the predator, as you guys I'm sure already know. And then finally, competition is the inevitable fight for resources where neither side benefits because they're both now going to have less of the resource available to them because the other one's fighting for the source. So competition is negative for both organism 1 and organism 2. Alright, so make sure you understand the difference between the types of symbiosis. There is an activity that we're going to be doing connected to that, so hopefully you've watched this video before that activity so that you can really get some practice on it. It's very important you understand. All of these are categorized as types of symbiosis, types of ways that organisms function together and live together, different types of relationships. Alright, let's get into succession now. Ecological succession talks about the overall development of an ecosystem. So we're talking about multiple generations of organisms and usually a pretty significant amount of time for that ecosystem from beginning to end. And we're going to talk about two categories of succession. There's primary succession and then there's secondary succession. One of them deals with an ecosystem starting basically out of nothing. And then the other one talks about an ecosystem redeveloping after a significant event. You guys are doing your research projects right now, talking about major events occurring to an ecosystem. Usually we're going to be talking about this second type, secondary succession, occurring in that ecosystem. So hopefully this will be a good thing for you to be able to connect to your research papers. Primary succession refers to the early initial development of an ecosystem. So if we're talking about an area that has absolutely no life on it whatsoever, there aren't too many places on Earth that are really like this unless something happens. So one way or the other, there's absolutely nothing on the surface, not even any soil. That's the key. If there is absolutely no soil present in an ecosystem, that means that there can't be any sort of plant life living on that ecosystem, because we talked in the previous video about the nitrogen or carbon cycles being necessary to be brought in from the soil. So all these elements and nutrients are very important to be brought from the soil. So no plant life can occur without soil. So we have to start by developing soil in that ecosystem. So that's the key. If there's no soil and we have a developing ecosystem coming from that, we're talking about primary succession. Now you're going to ask me, how can you possibly make an ecosystem out of an environment with absolutely no soil? Well, the answer is you have to make soil. So soil is really nothing but a whole bunch of living components that have been decayed and decomposers are broken down, and that decomposed biomass builds up after a while until you have soil. So to get things going, you need an organism that's actually capable of functioning in this barren wasteland, in this environment where nothing's going on. Those organisms are usually what we refer to as pioneer species. A pioneer species is an organism that is able to start that living process and start a food chain and ecosystem in that environment with nothing else there. So typically we're obviously going to talk about some sort of a producer that's able to make its own food, because if it's the only thing there, obviously there's no food source that it can feed off of. So lichen is actually a very unique scenario here. Lichen is its own mutualistic relationship between forms of algae, which is a producer, and fungus, which are the decomposers. So they kind of help each other out and work together. So lichen is an organism that can actually survive in this flat area. Now they have to be brought in somehow. Usually we're going to talk about a coastline and the tide bringing in some lichen into this new barren wasteland, and that lichen is able to attach itself to some bare rock, and little by little produce all the sugars it needs so the fungus side can feed off of it, and they'll kind of grow and develop. And as the fungus decomposes the dead lichen, it breaks down and starts developing into its own soil. Now we talk about barren rock or bare rock. How does that happen? There are three typical examples of how you can develop bare rock where there might have been living organisms there in the past. The most common one that I want you guys to remember is a volcanic eruption. If a volcanic eruption occurs, and we're talking about significant lava being released, that magma coming out of the volcano and actually demolishing anything on the surface within a given area. Once it cools, that lava has now become the new earth layer. Everything that was living is now completely dead and completely covered by the volcano, or by the lava. So now we have a brand new bare rock surface with absolutely no life on it. So that's the one I want you to remember specifically in terms of where primary succession can occur. In recent history, if there's some sort of a volcanic eruption where the lava and the magma that's coming out completely covers wherever the ecosystem was, and that now as it cools becomes the new rock layer, the new surface of the earth, that's where we can have primary succession occur, because there's absolutely nothing there, so there's no soil. The lichen comes in, starts going through its own life cycle. Over time, some lichen die off, and the fungus of the lichen, the fungus within that relationship, are decomposing the dead organisms, and over time you start developing all this layer of biomass that will eventually become soil. Once you have soil, guess what you can have? Plants, exactly. So now you have plants and you're ready to develop that ecosystem. So once producers come into play, now we start talking about consumers being able to migrate in the area. If you have your herbivores, your grazers, they see there's a whole lot of plant life available now out of nowhere. Huge amount of resources, so they're going to call up their friends and get them over there and start feeding off of it, and they'll start living in that ecosystem, one thing after another. You start bringing in other consumers, carnivores, omnivores being brought in until you eventually can develop into a fully functional ecosystem. So all of that can develop starting with lichen here at the primary set. So primary succession, again, is when there is absolutely no soil present, and therefore we need pioneer species like lichen to come and be able to develop an area where they can grow and start to develop the soil over time. Once you have soil, you can have plants. Once you have plants, now you bring in the consumers, and everything can develop again from there. So if there's some sort of drastic volcanic eruption somewhere and that's your research topic, you could definitely, hopefully, find some scenarios and some research about how a new ecosystem could have very well developed. It may not be the whole area, but at least in a unique part, you can see how a new ecosystem might have developed in that area over time. Alright, so that's primary succession. Secondary succession is what happens when soil is already present. You see that second bullet? It says it only occurs in areas with soil. So only if there's already soil present, and maybe the whole area was demolished for something, or a whole lot of damage occurred because of an event, as long as soil is still present, then a new ecosystem can develop pretty quickly. Whether it's exactly the same as the old or not kind of depends on a lot of factors, but as long as soil is present, plant life can develop pretty fast, and you bring in the herbivores and the other consumers pretty quickly after that. So the secondary succession is the one that deals with major weather patterns for the most part. So most of you guys that are doing any sort of a strong weather pattern, like tsunami, different maybe earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, things like that, that are not too overwhelming. When we saw flooding in the last one, that's for more severe scenario. But if we're talking about something quick, like a flash flood because of hurricanes and things like that, those are things that could definitely lead to a secondary succession, because you're wiping out a lot of the plant life that's out there, but the soil is still present. Another great example of this is forest fires. When forest fires kill off a lot of the plant life and possibly the animal life that's there, or at least the animals have to leave because the plants are all dead, the soil's still there. Fire doesn't burn soil. The soil's still there, and it still has nutrients available. It still has the ability of redeveloping and allowing plants to regrow. So the soil being there is the key. As long as the event still keeps soil, but a new set of plants and consumers start to develop from it, now we're talking about a secondary succession. So the majority of your research projects are going to deal with secondary succession, but I do expect you to connect one of the two to your project. Okay, this does typically happen faster. And then the term pioneer species kind of takes a new meaning, because you don't need things like lichen now. You don't need things that it can survive without even soil. Now you have soil, so there's a whole list of plants that can easily start to redevelop if they're brought in through wind. Maybe there's enough pollination happening, there's enough wind being brought in, so some of the seeds get drifted back into the area. As long as soil's there, it can regrow pretty fast. Alright, so this does happen faster, and the overall development of the ecosystem is usually much faster as well. So secondary succession can happen pretty quickly. Primary succession typically takes a pretty long time to develop into that full environment. That full environment, as you can see, is what we see at the end of this slide here, where we have mature plant life with animal life within it. So this kind of gives you an example of a secondary succession. Notice the key here is starting with year 1, after cultivation, which is after the event. Year 1, you notice there's still soil in the ground. There's no point where you're starting with bare rock. That's the key. If you ever see a diagram like this, if it's starting with bare rock, no soil, and then slowly developing it into a pretty large ecosystem, that's primary succession. But as long as soil is present, that means there's been an ecosystem there in the past. A lot of organisms have been decayed and developed into soil. So there is a substantial ecosystem presence that caused all of the soil to stay. So we're not starting from scratch here. This is just the redevelopment of an area that has been wiped out for a number of reasons. So now we have secondary succession developing that's allowing the little by little addition of plant life and other consumers to be brought in, and over time it becomes a pretty flourishing ecosystem. Once it gets to that point where it's a mature ecosystem, the term for that is called a climax community. So climax means like the peak or the end. So in a climax community we have the majority of the ecosystem fully sustainable, fully added. Basically it's reached its limit of organisms that can survive within it, because it hit that carrying capacity for a lot of different things. Based on food, water, shelter, and space, only so many organisms can live in a given area. You guys did an activity based on that as well. So a community that's hit its peak kind of has set up all of its available resources. So now, in terms of organisms coming in, they have to live within those means. So before that, things were slowly developing, getting bigger and bigger, and more things were available. So there really wasn't a climax community, and for the same reason, there wasn't a carrying capacity, because each organism had a food source that kept growing. But now once you hit that climax community, everything's kind of balanced out and leveled out, so all the organisms have to find their place within that ecosystem, or else some of them are going to die, or they're going to have to go somewhere else. So once you hit that climax community, that's when you've reached the end of either a primary or a secondary succession. So climax community is the largest one. Doesn't always mean big trees like you see there. Different environments have very different plant life, so it could just be prairie land, all grass, but there's no more grass that's going to be available in that area. There are no other plants that are going to grow in that area, so the herbivores and the other consumers feeding within that environment and that ecosystem have to be able to live within those means. Alright, so this can kind of continue to change, as you see, in response to climate and other factors. Once you hit a climax community, you can have another major weather event wiping out the majority of the plant and animal life, and now we have a whole new secondary succession starting to develop. Or we could have a volcanic eruption come in and completely wipe out even the soil, so now there's nothing on the surface, and we can develop a new ecosystem through primary succession, as long as lichen and things like it, other pioneer species like it, can get onto that ecosystem. Alright guys, so that's it. I hope that was a lot quicker than the other ones. Just make sure you're comfortable with the types of symbiosis, mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. Understand how predation and competition kind of play in how organisms have to live together and involve themselves with each other. And then the two types of succession in terms of how ecosystems develop over time. Primary is no soil, secondary is with soil. So as long as soil is present and a new ecosystem develops, that's secondary. If there's no soil, it's primary. Okay guys, thanks a lot. Enjoy your night, and I'll see you guys when I see you.